Name's Captain Joe Matheson, if you don't mind, and 24 years ago I did something the manuals still pretend never happened. I set a fully loaded Boeing 737-800 down in the middle of a Nebraska cornfield and walked 204 souls, crew included, out through the rear air stairs without so much as a scraped elbow. That single afternoon rewired every circuit in my life, and tonight, before my ticker or the cancer beats me to the punch, I'm going to tell you why a maneuver that saved everyone on board got me labeled a national threat. Now, before we throttle forward, do me one quick favor, tap that little thumbs up, maybe punch subscribe, so the suits can't bury this story the way they buried me. Engine stable? Good. Let's climb. It was August 25, 2001, Phoenix to Chicago, Flight 2281, tail N, 276 MW. Big blue sky, light chop forecast over Kansas, 6-person crew, 198 passengers, and a cargo manifest that read like a grocery receipt, suitcases, golf clubs, one pet carrier. Routine. I was 41, ex-Air Force A-10 driver from Kansas City, still shaking desert dust out of my memory and calling 32,000 feet, coffee altitude. My first officer, Dana Reeves, sharp kid, checklist queen, was reciting the crew's items when the lower ICA's panel flashed amber cargo door, the cabin altitude horn howled, and the whole ship shivered like a tuning fork. Masks on, thrust idle, descending to 10,000 should have been the drill, except the flight computer had other ideas. It ignored me and swung us 70 miles off course toward restricted Colorado Springs airspace. Let me tell you something, airplanes obey code, not conscience, and somebody had hardwired that detour. I snapped the autopilot off, yanked the flight control computer breakers, unorthodox, sure, but my stick, my rules, and hand flew her through a slow leak in the hydraulics while Dana broadcast Mayday after Mayday into radio silence thick enough to chew. Below us, an ocean of late summer corn rolled out to every horizon. Asphalt was 90 miles east, we didn't have 90 miles. I whispered, we're trading concrete for agriculture. Dana gulped, then nodded like a soldier whose mission just changed. Flaps 15, spoilers armed, gear down by feel, the indicator lights were dark, and we skimmed a foot above the stalks before settling in. Touchdown felt like sliding a dinner plate across a tablecloth, rough but dead straight. We stopped a breath before a drainage ditch. When the dust settled, I could smell sweet starch, hot circuits, and raw fear. Passengers clapped, cried, hugged strangers. I just listened to the engine spin down and thought, they said protocol. I said people. Within an hour, unmarked SUVs beat the ambulances to the scene. Men in immaculate suits jogged straight for the aft cargo hold, ignoring everyone else. One of them muttered, the sample wasn't compromised, but the pilot will be. That's when I knew the real turbulence was only beginning. The crate they guarded, sealed, humming, faintly glowing, is why I'm talking to you from a rusted trailer instead of a flight deck. The FAA tore up my license, the airline scrubbed my name, my wife filed papers, my kids stopped calling. For 20 years I kept silent under a handshake gag order from people who don't leave paper trails. Silence bought me time, but time's almost up. Stage 4 lung cancer, maybe 3 months. So tonight I'm rolling down the runway one last time, clearing the air before final approach. I'm not fishing for pity, just witnesses. Buckle in, because when I open that cargo door for you, the glow might keep you up till sunrise. The cabin's pressurized for honesty. Ready for takeoff. I was born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, a place where the sky stretches bigger than your hometown dreams, and folks tip their hats to a stranger just because you're breathing the same air. My dad ran a small diesel repair shop on the east side. My mom taught 4th grade at the neighborhood school. Weekends meant church bake sales, little league games, and me sprawled in the backyard, staring up at Cessnas buzzing like bumblebees overhead. By the time I hit 16, I'd soloed in a Piper Cherokee and logged my first real hours. Let me tell ya, nothing beats the hum of that Lycoming engine under a wide-open throttle. I sold my Mustang at 18, poured every penny into flight lessons, and earned my private pilot certificate before I could even vote. In '89, I joined the U.S. Air Force. Desert Storm was my baptism by fire. There's no better teacher than sandstorms, surface-to-air missiles, and a sky lit by tracer rounds. I flew a tens, you know, the warthogs, the kind of bird that makes you feel like a surgeon with a shotgun, precise, brutal, and absolutely dependable when lives depend on you. I learned to trust my instruments over my instincts, to run checklists like a surgeon counting sponges, and to lead crews who'd follow you into hell and back. By the time I hung up my uniform in '96, I'd logged over 2,000 hours in combat sorties, gone through line training at Laughlin, and earned the call sign, Tracker, not for my hunting skills, but because I never lost sight of my wingman. Transitioning to commercial aviation was supposed to be a breeze. In '97, Midwestern Air hired me as a first officer on the MD-80 before upgrading me to captain on the Boeing 737-800 in 1999. The schedules were brutal, pre-flight briefings at 0300 local, overlapping, reserve weeks, and more coffee than anyone should legally consume. But I loved every minute of it. IFR trips through winter storms, CAT scans of clear air turbulence, the subtle art of managing cabin announcements with the gentlest inflection. You learn to juggle personalities at 35,000 feet, and you grin when you feel that little thump as the gear houses lock. Crew resource management, SOP adherence, flight deck cross-checks, these weren't buzzwords to me, they were lifelines. Off-duty, I tried to be the perfect Midwesterner. Family dinners, church potlucks, backyard BBQs. Julie, my wife, baked the best apple pie in Jackson County. My son, Mikey, was 9 when I forced him into a co-pilot's seat at the flight simulator. He'd grin so wide I thought the kid would burst. Friends called me steady as a rock, dependable, maybe a bit dry, but always there when you needed a hand. I wore my wings like a badge of honor and my logbook like an open diary, each flight entry a snapshot of routine turned remarkable. To be honest, I never imagined my story would veer off the published course. Life felt predictable in that comforting, autopilot sort of way. I knew how to handle engine failures, rapid decompressions, even a dual generator loss at cruise. But nothing in the training manual teaches you how to fight a ghost load in the cargo bay or how to navigate a political cyclone when the feds come knocking. No simulator ever prepped me for the moment when saving lives made me public enemy number one. But that's part of who I am, a pilot who trusts his gut, honors his crew, and puts people over protocol. 28 years of military and civilian flying taught me that aircraft speak in hydraulics and hydraulics don't lie. You earn respect with every safe landing, every unspoken good flight on the ramp. I'm the same guy who scrubbed into Desert Storm sorties, who flew into Chicago's O'Hare through a white-knuckle blizzard, and who, on one ordinary August afternoon, made the toughest decision of my 50-plus-year life. That decision defines me now, but it didn't start with the cornfield. It started here, in the endless Kansas sky, with a kid who dreamed of touching the clouds and never backing down when the wind shifted. That morning in Phoenix, the air was already thick with heat when I rolled up to Gate 12 in the worn-out Midwestern ramp truck. The sun hadn't even hit its stride, but the radar screen on my iPad was already humming with convective buildups over the high desert. Dana Reeves, my first officer, was waiting by the boarding stairs, clipboard in hand and that checklist queen glare I'd learned to respect. Behind us, the 737-800, Flight 2281 to Chicago, gleamed under the floodlights, its paint slightly faded but its engines as sharp as ever. I waved to the lead flight attendant, Maria Delgado, whose calm smile was the opposite of how I felt whenever the fueler pulled up, routine, but also the moment when you'd ask the right questions and catch any oddity before it moved. We climbed the air stairs together and went through our walk-around. Tires looked good, access panels latched tight, cargo hold door locked. When I peeked into the avionics bay, I nodded at our ground tech, Pete Sarge Richardson, retired Marine Corps, single gear tattooed on his forearm, who dropped me a quick thumbs up. That's when I noticed the extra padlock on the freight door, wrapped in government-issue tape stamped, restricted, do not open. I asked Pete about it. He looked at me, shrugged, and said in that low voice of his, "Captain, that one's above my pay grade." They sealed it at the terminal. He tapped the tape and grinned. "It's glowing, too, if you catch it just right." Weird. My heart kicked a notch. Cargo holds usually smell of upholstery and dust, not something that glowed. But orders were orders, and the paperwork checked out. So up in the cockpit we went, sliding into our seats while Maria counted heads on the ramp. By the time we pushed back, the cabin lights were dimmed, and 204 pairs of eyes glimmered in scheduled anticipation. I ran the engines up through idle, checked hydraulic pressures, and listened for the whine of each APU spooling down. Dana droned off the before takeoff items, flaps set, trim green, flight instruments aligned, while I keyed the mic for Phoenix ground. Taxi to runway 8L, contact tower at 128.4. Simple as Sunday church service back home in Kansas City. Except I kept glancing at that sealed container, filed away in my mind somewhere between routine and red flag. We lined up, thrust levers forward, and the old girl roared to life, wheels dancing into acceleration. I felt that familiar surge as we broke ground, flaps retracting in 2 positive climbs. Climbing through 10,000 feet, I idled the throttles to climb thrust, slid the chart into the holder, and offered Dana a sideways grin. "Just another Tuesday, right?" She chuckled, but I could tell her eyes were on the ICAS panel. Then came the call from clearance delivery reminding us of a deviation for weather, minor zigzag eastward, and I nodded, punched it into the FMS, and adjusted our heading. Everything felt normal until it didn't. Somewhere above Kansas, the warning horn, the cabin altitude alert, and that odd ICAS message crashed our comm. I slammed the mic. "Mayday, Flight 2281. We've got a decompression, seeking immediate lower altitude and vectors home." No traffic called us back, no controllers acknowledged. And that's when the rail trigger dropped us into a tailspin of questions. Why had the automated route shifted us toward Colorado Springs? And what hell of a secret was locked behind that glowing crate? In that moment, with Dana's voice steady beside me and the cornfields of Nebraska still hours away, I knew I was at the edge of everything I'd ever trained for, and over that thin aluminum skin, something was waiting to change my life forever. Right after I flipped off the autopilot, thinking I'd wrested control back in my hands, everything went sideways. First, the hydraulics light blinked out, both green systems collapsing like a pair of dominoes under my fingertips. Suddenly the yoke stiffened, the rudder pedals stiff as a busted hinge, and I felt the whole airframe groan. Let me tell you, when you're 40,000 feet up and your controls start locking you out, that's not the time for a confidence check. Dana's voice cut in steady, "Hydraulics 2 and 3, Captain." No pressure. My gut sank. Without hydraulics we'd lost spoilers, thrust reversers, hell, we'd barely have steering through the nose wheel. Next came the electronics. The FMS screen flickered, then went blank, replaced by a cryptic error, "Automated diversion active." To be honest, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Why was it rerouting us toward Colorado Springs? That airspace was locked tighter than Fort Knox, no commercial traffic allowed. I jabbed the CDU keys, tried to override it. No response. Every sequence of button mashing felt like slamming your head against a steel door. My training said, "Trust your instruments," but which instrument? The bleary screen lying to me or my hands flying on the yoke? And up in the cabin, Maria Delgado's voice came through the PA, her smile in the flight deck turned brittle. "Passengers, please remain calm. We're experiencing technical difficulties and will update you momentarily." I heard murmurs, some shuffle of oxygen masks rattling. Behind those few seconds of calm, 100 hearts in the cabin were hammering. My dilemma solidified: blend back into the automated reroute and risk trespassing into forbidden territory, or force the issue by shutting systems down and taking manual control, potentially making the jet unflyable. Then the cabin altitude horn started blaring again, more insistent this time, and I saw the gauge ticking past 10,000 feet. Masks dangled unused, and people were gasping for air like they'd been dunked in ice water. "Dana, we need a descent. Emergency descent, now." She punched in the drill, but the autopilot fought us, pitching the nose up as if to spite our commands. I leaned forward, voice low, "I'm taking the bypass valve open. Brace yourself." With a yank on the dump lever, we plummeted, green needles swinging left, right, shepherding us toward breathable atmosphere. The G-forces pinned us in our seats, and for a moment the whole jet felt like a roller coaster drop without tracks. At 30,000 feet we hit denser air, but the relief was fleeting. Engines responded sluggishly, hydraulic pumps starving for pressure, and I watched the N1 spooling unevenly. "Manual roll control only," I barked. Dana's hand hovered over the aileron trim, making micro-adjustments. It was ugly, but we stayed upright. Below us, the Kansas plains rolled away, corn stalks bowing in the wind. I caught my reflection in the windshield, gray hair plastered to my forehead, jaw clenched so hard I could taste copper. By now, our radio squawk was a digital SOS, 7700 on the transponder, Mayday on 121.5, and still no controller response. Every mile we strayed, that crate in the back was humming like a wounded beast, and I could almost feel its presence through the bulkhead. Should I tell the cabin crew to open that door and see what was inside? Absolutely not, that was a recipe for panic. But ignorance wasn't any safer. Whatever was locked in there was either ticking or pulsing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching us. My mind raced: follow the autopilot's secret patch and become a trespasser in my own skies, or wrestle with a half-broken jet and gamble on a field landing. That was the crux of it: protocol versus humanity. The manuals didn't cover glowing government crates or dodging clandestine cargo. They covered runways, V1 speeds, stall recoveries. They did not cover this horror show in blue skies. And standing at that threshold, I realized this was bigger than any checklist. This was life and death, truth versus cover-up, and the choice I made next would fracture everything I'd ever known. The moment I realized we were truly past the edge wasn't when the hydraulics died or the autopilot locked us into that forbidden corridor. It was when the left engine's roar dropped to a wheeze and the right one started coughing like it had swallowed a crow. I'll never forget that split second when the entire cockpit went quiet except for the clatter of failing systems and my own heartbeat pounding so loud I thought my ears might burst. Dana's eyes met mine in the reflection of the windshield, calm as a lake at dawn, but I saw the storm behind them. "Gear by hand?" she asked, voice steady. "Gear by hand," I replied, letting the words settle like stones in my gut. Man, it was crazy. In all my years flying at tens through Desert Storm and shuttling civilians in the commercial world, nothing prepared me for a Boeing slipping toward terra firma with half its landing gear locked out and two engines flirting with flameout. I reached down, found the emergency extension crank beside my left knee, and began to turn it, slow, agonizing clicks echoing through the cockpit. Every revolution was a prayer, every click a promise that we still had a chance. Outside, the Nebraska cornfield spread like a green sea, silent witnesses to our fight. I glanced at our altitude, 2,500 feet and falling fast. Fuel needles in the red. Hydraulic pressure, 0. And somewhere in the darkness of that locked cargo hold, that glowing container hummed its secret, daring me to expose it. But I had no choice. Protocol be damned, lives were on the line. Landing checklist, I barked through clenched teeth. Dana ran the items as I cranked the gear, down, 3 green lights glowing like beacons of hope. Flaps to 20, spoilers armed, landing lights on. I felt the jet's spine straighten, as if she sensed rescue. We were committed. No more go-arounds, no more second-guessing. In the cabin, Maria's voice crackled, "Brace. Brace." I heard muffled thuds as passengers leaned into their seatbacks, arms crossed. A mother murmured comfort to her child. I imagined every one of those souls counting on me. Then the field rushed up, rows of corn stalks bending under our swirling slipstream, the sky turning a deeper, more urgent blue as the ground leapt toward us. The windshield rattled. I eased back on the yoke to flare, visualizing the perfect touchdown point I'd picked through the haze, between a drainage ditch and a barbed wire fence. We kissed the earth with a jolt that shook the whole airframe, a thunderclap of metal on stalks, and the 737 slid forward on its belly, spraying corn husks like confetti. The cabin rocked, screams turned to gasps, then silence, then cheers. I felt the grain beneath our tires crush and crackle, the jet's weight settling, and I held the yoke firm until speed bled off to idle. We stopped 15 feet from that ditch, wings level, engines silent at last. Dust and debris choked the windows, but through the haze I saw Dana release her harness and grin like we'd just won the lottery. Maria emerged from the ceiling hatch, eyes wide, shouting, "Everyone, out the back, single file." I sat for a heartbeat longer, throat thick, chest heaving. Then I stood, tore off my headset, and stepped into a thunder of applause. 204 faces turned to me, relieved, grateful, alive. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. But in the back of my mind, that agent's voice echoed, the sample wasn't compromised, but the pilot will be. In that moment, walking down the air stairs into a field I never wanted to land on, I knew the fallout was just beginning. Yet even as sirens wailed in the distance, I whispered to myself, it wasn't a field. It was a damn decision. And I'd make that decision again in a heartbeat if it meant saving each one of them. By the time the SUVs and EMS trucks finally surrounded us, the cornfield looked more like a war zone than farmland. Medics ran up to tend to anyone feeling woozy. Maria Delgado shepherded the last passenger through the rear stairs, and I stayed in the cockpit long enough to feel the weight lift off my shoulders, only to be replaced by the question, what now? The FAA investigators arrived first, clipboards in hand, eyes narrowed as they photographed every dent and leaf fragment. Within minutes, unmarked agents in dark suits stepped out of a black sedan and guarded the cargo hold like it was a uranium vault. I was escorted down the air stairs by a uniformed officer who kept his face impassive. I tried to explain the hydraulics failure, the autopilot override, the emergency descent, but he merely handed me a form. Statement. Over the next 24 hours, I was debriefed by the FAA, grilled by the National Transportation Safety Board, and interrogated by the Department of Justice. Controllers replayed radar tracks showing our deviation into restricted airspace. They scrolled through cockpit voice recordings where Dana and I exchanged maydays and brace. They pored over the flight data recorder for anomalies. Every action I'd taken to save lives was suddenly cast as a potential threat to national security. I answered each question as clearly as I could. I pulled the breakers to override an unauthorized reroute. I landed because the hydraulics failed and passengers were suffocating. I prioritized people over procedure. Their notes filled binders, their faces didn't flicker. Meanwhile, word leaked to the press. First stories praising the hero pilot, then headlines vilifying me as rogue aviator, skyjack suspect, even terrorist. Midwestern Air scrubbed my name from their website and cut off my pension. Julie, who'd once celebrated my safe flights with a slice of apple pie, sat me down when I returned home and slid divorce papers across the table. "Your choices," she said quietly, "destroyed our family." Mikey stared at me through the paperwork, his 9-year-old eyes now grown distant. The neighbors stopped waving. The church bulletin stopped listing my name. In one brutal week, I lost my career, my home, my family, and my reputation. There was a hush agreement with the DOJ, no lawsuit, no press conference, and I'd be left unmolested. In return, I signed away my right to talk about the glowing container or why the autopilot was hijacked. For 20 years I lived under that unspoken gag order, working odd jobs, rebuilding model airplanes in a rickety trailer by an abandoned airstrip, haunted by circuits and memories I couldn't share. I watched younger pilots climb into cockpits, trusting their instruments, never knowing how easily you can be turned from savior to suspect. But the passengers, those 200 souls, wrote letters. Some found me through old newspaper clippings, others through a charity flight I volunteered for when no one asked questions. Every Christmas for a decade, I'd get cards from families thanking me for that decision, reminding me, "You saved me." Their words patched some of the wound that Washington agents opened. Their gratitude reminded me that protocol fears power more than people. Now, with cancer pulling me toward final descent and that crate's secret still locked behind government doors, I'm finally speaking out. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Hell, I don't deserve it. I'm only asking for the truth to land as gently as that 737 did in the corn. Because if a man can be punished for saving lives, then the real danger is a system that values procedure over people. And that, my friends, is a flight path even the bravest pilot won't cross without a fight. The weeks and months that followed felt like walking through a haze of half-remembered dreams, as if the Cornfield landing happened to someone else and I was left clutching the fragments. My hand still trembled when I picked up a model airplane, and every creak of an old floorboard sounded like the warning horn in the cabin that day. I traded my flight suit for work boots and a toolbox, tinkering with small engines on vintage Cessnas, finding comfort in the simplicity of pulleys and pistons that obeyed every command. The world outside my trailer moved on. The skies teemed with flights I would never captain, newspapers churned out new headlines I refused to read, and friends I once trusted became strangers who whispered about that pilot. I learned to greet the sunrise alone, sipping bitter coffee from a chipped mug as I watched the horizon for storms that, these days, I could only dream of flying into. At first, I wrestled with bitterness, and anger so hot it scorched everything it touched. I replayed every radio call, every autopilot override, every heartbeat between the alarms and the touchdown, wondering if there was something I could have done differently to keep my life intact. But grief turned to quiet resolve. I realized that the same instincts that drove me to land in a field instead of a runway, the instinct to put people over paperwork, still lived inside me. It whispered that procedures exist to serve safety, not to cage good decisions. I started writing letters again, this time not to regulators or lawyers but to strangers who'd sent me thank you cards over the years. Their words became fuel, a reminder that gratitude outlasts condemnation, and that one right choice can echo through decades. My faith shifted too. I once prayed for clear skies on every takeoff, now I prayed for courage to speak truth in the face of powerful silence. I walked church aisles slower, letting the echo of my own footsteps remind me that forgiveness is a long runway, not a quick descent. I found peace in mentoring young pilots at a local flight school, teaching them to respect their instruments but never to let them override their conscience. Most nights, I sit on my trailer's porch with a lantern, watching the corn stalks sway, whispering to the wind that it wasn't a field, it was a damn decision, and feeling a strange kind of pride. Cancer may have clipped my wings, but it hasn't grounded my spirit. The aftermath of that day forged a steel in my soul, an unbreakable conviction that the right choice is worth the world's wrath. that saving lives always trumps saving face, and that even when the system tries to bury you, the truth will rise like an unyielding sunrise. After everything I've been through, I've learned that true courage isn't about following orders blindly, it's about knowing when to break them to do what's right. I discovered that systems and protocols exist to guide us, but they're not infallible. Sometimes they become chains that trap human judgment. Saving lives may come with consequences, and standing by your convictions can cost you everything, yet the weight of regret from inaction is heavier than any price you pay for doing your duty. I used to believe that my worth was measured by my rank, my hours flown, or the clean record in my logbook. Now I know my value is defined by the lives I touch and the truths I uphold, even when it means facing down powerful institutions. Integrity isn't a line in a manual, it's the quiet voice that tells you to flip off the autopilot, to crank down the gear by hand, to speak up when silence feels safer. That voice guided me into a cornfield to save 200 souls, and it's the same one pushing me to share this story now, despite the cost. In the end, I've learned that honesty can be the fiercest form of freedom, and when you face the longest night of your life, remember that one clear decision under pressure can shine through decades of darkness. If you hold on to that truth, you'll never truly be grounded. In the years after that day, word of Flight 2281's miracle landing spread quietly through pilot lounges and training centers even as the official record stayed sealed behind government paper walls. New captains whispered about the guy who hand-cranked his gear down when the electrics died, who refused to let an autopilot hijack his conscience, who set a jet down on a patch of corn and walked away with every passenger intact. They called it Matheson's lesson, and flight instructors would repeat the story during emergency procedure drills alongside engine failure scenarios and cabin altitude warnings. I never sought the legend, but I heard it, over clinking coffee cups in crew rooms, in off-the-record forums, even once from a trainee who'd watched a recording of our cockpit voice tape in school. Professionally, though, the fallout never really lifted. Airlines tightened their security protocols, cargo manifests grew longer, and flight management software got hard limits to prevent manual override. In a twist of irony, the industry built more automated safeguards to keep pilots from making exactly the split-second decisions they trained for. Ironic, because what saved 204 lives was a pilot breaking protocol. So I stayed on the sidelines, mentoring cadets at a regional school, emphasizing that machines serve us, and not the other way around. My classroom was filled with bright-eyed students who grew up on glass cockpits and GPS overlays. I taught them to listen to the hum of hydraulics, to feel the airplane through their fingertips, and to keep their hearts in a moment of crisis. Outside aviation, the story took on its own life. A handful of families stayed in touch, celebrating anniversaries of that landing with small reunions under a harvest moon. Local news outlets ran feature pieces calling it Nebraska's gift to air safety, and a small museum in Lincoln put up a replica of the corn stalks and landing gear prints as a tribute to human judgment over blind automation. I never visited, I preferred to keep the memory personal. Personally, the incident reshaped my approach to life. I refused offers to speak at big conferences, wary of turning the thing into a spectacle. Instead, I championed small-scale discussions on decision-making ethics, urging every professional, pilots, doctors, firefighters, to remember that protocol is a guide, not a jailer. Even now, years after the fact, I wake up at dawn and glance at the empty field beside my trailer, half expecting to see that Boeing silhouette against the rising sun. And while the aviation world continues to chase efficiency with algorithms and autopilots, I rest easier knowing that somewhere out there, pilots still carry a silent vow. If the moment demands it, they'll flip off the autopilot, crank the gear by hand, and set people above procedure, just like Captain Joe Matheson did. Here we are at the finish line, and I've laid bare every whistle, every warning horn, every second of fear and resolve that led me into a Nebraska cornfield instead of a runway. I've shown you the moment I chose people over paperwork, the price I paid in reputation and family, and the quiet peace I found in knowing I did the right thing. Now it's your turn. Think back to a time when you faced a choice between following the rules and doing what your gut told you was right, maybe at work, in a relationship, or just standing up for someone who couldn't speak. Would you channel that same stubborn courage and risk losing everything so that others could live? Or would you stay locked into the system, even if it meant watching disaster unfold? In the end, I learned that integrity isn't about never making a mistake. It's about owning the moment when you decide to act. So tell me, if you were strapped into my cockpit that August afternoon, with 200 lives on the line and every protocol screaming at you to hold course, what would you do? Would you flip off the autopilot and trust your hands, your heart, and a crank to lower the gear? Or would you stay obedient to the letter, even if it meant watching the sky turn from blue to chaos? Drop your answer in the comments. No filter, no excuses. I want to know who you are when the autopilot drops out and you're left alone with your choices.